Ever wondered what happens when someone can't handle rejection? What happens when love turns into obsession and heartbreak pushes a person to the brink of madness? In the quiet suburbs of DeKalb County, Georgia, a chilling answer to those questions unfolded. A tragedy so harrowing that it left an entire community grappling with disbelief and sorrow. It started as a typical December morning. A mother was preparing for the day ahead. Her young grandchildren played nearby, and her daughter-in-law was likely tending to the small but precious moments that made up their daily life. They were a family, connected by love and shared dreams, but in the shadows, something far darker was brewing. A man, consumed by rejection and a desperate need for control, had decided that if he couldn't have happiness, no one else could either. In his twisted logic, love was not something to cherish, it was something to possess. And when possession failed, destruction became his answer. Imagine the fear, the helplessness, as a person you once trusted turns against you. How does someone reach the point where they believe ending multiple lives, including those of children, is the only way to soothe their pain? What could possibly drive a person to such unimaginable lengths? As the sun rose over DeKalb County that day, the lives of 4 innocent people were about to be stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. The man responsible didn't just end their lives, he shattered the peace of an entire neighborhood, leaving behind only grief, unanswered questions, and a chilling reminder of how dangerous unchecked emotions can be. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Were there warning signs that went unnoticed? And what can we learn from this devastating case to stop something like this from happening again? This isn't just a story about a breakup that turned deadly, it's a stark look at obsession, rejection, and the devastating ripple effect one act of violence can have. Join us as we piece together the details of a case that shook a community and delve into the mind of a man who couldn't let go. The answers might haunt you, but they also just might open your eyes to the warning signs hiding in plain sight. DeKalb County, Georgia, an area known for its sprawling suburbs, diverse community, and the quiet hum of family life. It's the kind of place where parents wave their kids off to school with a sense of assurance, where neighbors share warm smiles across fences, and where violent crime, while not unheard of, feels like a distant threat. But on the morning of December 3rd, 2024, that sense of safety was obliterated, leaving a community reeling and desperate for answers. It was a Tuesday morning. For most, it was just another day. The streets were alive with the usual weekday rhythms. Children heading to school, commuters rushing to work, and retirees enjoying their morning coffee. The Johnson-Samuel household, like many others, was preparing for the day ahead. Inside, Molly and Johnson was already up. A hard-working and fiercely protective mother, she had recently moved to the area in search of a fresh start for her family. Molly had faced her share of challenges over the years, but she carried an unshakable resolve to build a better future for herself and her loved ones. Her daughter-in-law, Kaylin Samuel, was also up early. Kaylin, just 25, was the mother of 2 young children, a spirited 5-year-old and a sweet-natured 3-year-old. She was devoted to her kids, the kind of mother who found joy in the simplest moments, whether it was baking cookies on a rainy afternoon or reading bedtime stories that always seemed to run longer than planned. The household was bustling with activity. Kaylin was helping the kids with breakfast, their laughter filling the room, while Molly made plans for the day. But behind the smiles and the daily routines, there was an undercurrent of unease, a shadow that had been creeping closer for weeks. Jonathan Darden, a 32-year-old man who had been in a relationship with Molly, was no longer welcome in their lives. What had started as a promising romance had soured over time, marked by arguments, control, and a growing sense of danger. Molly had made the difficult decision to end the relationship, prioritizing her family's safety and well-being. But Jonathan wasn't ready to let go. The breakup had triggered something dark in Jonathan, something no one fully understood. He began to spiral, unable to accept Molly's decision. Friends and family noticed the signs, his erratic behavior, his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain contact, but no one could have predicted the lengths he would go to. That morning, as the sun rose over DeKalb County, Jonathan made his way to the house, Armed and determined, he was driven by a singular, twisted motive. If he couldn't have Malian, no one could. Around 10 a.m., the first gunshots rang out. The sound shattered the quiet morning, piercing through the suburban calm. Neighbors stopped in their tracks, their hearts racing as they tried to make sense of the noise. Some thought it might be fireworks, an unusual choice for a Tuesday morning. Others immediately felt the dread settle in their chests. They knew it was something far worse. Within minutes, the serene neighborhood became the epicenter of chaos. Police cars and emergency vehicles swarmed the scene, their sirens wailing. Yellow crime scene tape was quickly strung up, marking off a home that just hours before had been filled with the sounds of laughter and life. Inside, responders were met with a scene of unimaginable horror. Malian, Kaylin, and the two children were found dead, victims of a cold and calculated act of violence. Jonathan's body was also discovered, the perpetrator of the crime having turned the weapon on himself in a final, gruesome act. The news spread like wildfire. Residents stood outside their homes in stunned silence, exchanging whispers and shaken glances. How could this happen here, to a family so full of life? As investigators began their work, the details of the case trickled out, each one more heartbreaking than the last. This wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't a crime of opportunity. It was deliberate, premeditated, and deeply personal. The tragedy wasn't just about the loss of life. It was about the betrayal of trust, the breakdown of a relationship, and the devastating consequences of one man's inability to cope with rejection. The community was left grappling with unanswerable questions. How could someone so consumed by their emotions commit such an atrocity? Were there warning signs that were missed? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, could this have been prevented? In the days that followed, the case would dominate headlines, sparking conversations about domestic violence, emotional instability, and the devastating impact of unchecked anger. But to understand the full weight of what happened that morning, we must first understand the people at the heart of this story. The victims, whose lives were cut tragically short, and the man whose actions would leave an indelible scar on a grieving community. To truly understand the weight of this tragedy, we must first know the people at its heart. A mother, her daughter-in-law, and two innocent children who were robbed of their futures. These weren't just names in a police report. They were vibrant lives, each with dreams, struggles, and love stories of their own. At 43 years old, Malian Johnson was the glue that held her family together. Born and raised in Milwaukee, she was no stranger to hardship. As the eldest of three siblings, she grew up in a household where every dollar was stretched thin, but love and resilience were never in short supply. Her parents instilled in her a sense of responsibility that would shape her entire life. By the time Malian reached her 30s, she was a single mother raising her son in a world that often felt stacked against her. But she refused to let circumstances define her. She worked multiple jobs, from waitressing to cleaning houses, always keeping her focus on providing a better future for her family. Friends described her as someone who could find a silver lining in the darkest clouds, a trait that kept her going even when life became overwhelming. In 2023, Malian made the bold decision to move from Milwaukee to DeKalb County, Georgia. She saw the move as a fresh start, a chance to leave behind the struggles of her past and build something lasting for her family. It wasn't just about geography, it was about hope. She wanted a safer neighborhood for her grandchildren, better schools, and a community where they could thrive. But the move wasn't without its challenges. Starting over in a new state meant rebuilding her support system from scratch. Still, Malian took it in stride, joining local church groups and making connections with neighbors. For her, it was all worth it. Her family was her world, and every sacrifice she made was for them. If Malian was the matriarch, Kaylin Samuel was the heart of the family. At just 25, Kaylin had a presence that lit up any room she entered. She was the kind of person who could make strangers feel like lifelong friends within minutes of meeting them. Kaylin had married Malian's son Marcus in 2018. Their love story was one of shared dreams and mutual respect. Kaylin supported Marcus through his challenges, often serving as his biggest cheerleader when times got tough. Together, They dreamed of building a stable, loving home for their two children. Her children were everything to her. Kaylin poured herself into motherhood with unrelenting devotion. She planned themed birthday parties, sewed Halloween costumes by hand, and spent countless evenings cuddling on the couch, reading their favorite books. To Kaylin, being a mom wasn't just a role, it was her calling. But beneath the surface, there were struggles. Balancing her responsibilities as a mother and wife wasn't always easy, especially with Marcus away for work more often than not. Kaylin had leaned heavily on Malian for support, and the two women had formed a bond that went beyond the usual mother and daughter-in-law relationship. They were friends, confidants, and allies in the journey of raising a family. Then there were the children, whose lives had only just begun. 5-year-old Braylon was the kind of child who couldn't sit still for long. Curious and full of energy, he loved superheroes, dinosaurs, and anything that allowed his imagination to run wild. He was the first to greet visitors at the door, peppering them with questions and showing off his latest drawings. His younger sister, 3-year-old Amia, was the quieter of the two. She had a smile that could melt even the coldest hearts, and a penchant for following her big brother everywhere he went. Her favorite toy was a stuffed unicorn named Sparkles, which she carried with her everywhere, from bedtime to breakfast. Together, the siblings were inseparable. Braylon took his role as the big brother seriously, often holding Amia's hand as they walked to the park or helping her reach the cookie jar on the counter. Their laughter filled the house, a constant reminder of the simple joys that life could bring. Malian, Kaylin, Braylon, and Amia were more than just a family. They were a team. Despite the challenges they faced, they found joy in the everyday moments. Sunday dinners at the table, movie nights piled on the couch, and trips to the local park where the kids could run free while Malian and Kaylin chatted on the benches. But beneath the surface of their close-knit bond, trouble had been brewing. Malian's relationship with Jonathan Darden had become a source of tension in the household. While Kaylin tried to be supportive, she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Jonathan's presence brought. He was charming at first, but his behavior grew increasingly erratic as time went on. Malian had finally made the difficult decision to end things with Jonathan, and Kaylin had stood by her side through it all. They hoped the breakup would mark the end of his influence over their lives. They couldn't have known that Jonathan's obsession was only beginning to take a darker, more dangerous turn. As we unravel this story further, it becomes clear that this family was more than the sum of its parts. They were individuals with dreams, hopes, and love that intertwined in beautiful, complicated ways. And yet, in a matter of minutes, their lives would be violently ripped apart, leaving behind only memories and unanswered questions. To fully grasp the depth of the tragedy, we must delve into the troubled relationship between Malian Johnson and Jonathan Darden, a relationship that began with promise but ended in chaos and destruction. Jonathan Darden was, at first glance, an ordinary man. In his early 40s, he had a steady job as a delivery driver, a charming demeanor, and a smile that could light up a room. For someone like Malian, who had spent years shouldering the weight of her family's burdens alone, Jonathan's attention felt like a welcome reprieve. When they met in 2021, he was everything Malian thought she needed: kind, attentive, and supportive. Jonathan often spoke about his own struggles growing up, painting himself as someone who had overcome adversity. His ability to make Malian laugh during tough times drew her in, and soon they were spending most of their days together. But beneath Jonathan's charm lay a darker side. He had a history of emotional instability that he kept hidden from the world. Those close to him would later describe a man who struggled with feelings of inadequacy and abandonment, traits that made him intensely possessive in relationships. In the beginning, their relationship seemed idyllic. Jonathan would surprise Malian with flowers, help her with errands, and dote on her grandchildren as if they were his own. Malian's friends and family, however, noticed subtle red flags early on. Jonathan had a habit of dominating conversations and would bristle if anyone disagreed with him. He often needed reassurance, constantly seeking validation from Malian in ways that bordered on obsessive. Malian, ever the optimist, brushed off these concerns. She believed that Jonathan's neediness was a result of his past and that with patience and love she could help him heal. For a while, it seemed like she was right. Jonathan appeared to settle into their life together, becoming a regular presence at family gatherings and even helping with Braylon and Amia. But as time went on, Jonathan's behavior began to change. What once felt like attentiveness now felt like surveillance. He wanted to know where Malian was at all times, and grew visibly irritated when she spent time with friends or family without him. His once loving gestures turned into guilt trips if she didn't reciprocate exactly as he wanted. Kaylin, in particular, became wary of Jonathan. She had seen how he acted when Malian wasn't around, his temper flaring over small inconveniences, his tone sharp and condescending. When Kaylin gently brought up her concerns to Malian, the older woman dismissed them, saying Jonathan was just going through a rough patch. The tension escalated when Jonathan began showing up unannounced at Malian's church meetings or lunch outings with friends. He would claim he was just checking in, but his presence felt more like monitoring than concern. Malian started to feel smothered, yet she still hesitated to confront him directly. By late 2023, Malian had begun pulling away from Jonathan, sensing that the relationship was no longer healthy. Jonathan, however, clung tighter. He would call her incessantly, sometimes leaving dozens of voicemails in a single day. His messages swung wildly between professions of love and accusations of betrayal. When Malian suggested taking a break, Jonathan's response was chilling. He told her, "You're not going anywhere. You're all I have left." His words, meant to sound loving, came off as a warning. Jonathan's jealousy also extended to Malian's family. He resented the time she spent with Kaylin and the grandchildren, viewing them as competition for her attention. On one occasion, he angrily accused Malian of choosing them over me after she canceled dinner plans to babysit Braylon and Amia. In early 2024, after another explosive argument, Malian made the decision to end the relationship for good. It wasn't easy. Jonathan begged, cried, and even threatened to hurt himself if she left. But Malian knew she couldn't continue living under his shadow of control. For months, she tried to maintain a safe distance. She blocked his number, avoided places she knew he frequented, and leaned on her church community for support. Jonathan, however, refused to accept the breakup. He began showing up outside her home, sitting in his car for hours, and leaving notes on her doorstep. Kaylin grew increasingly alarmed. She urged Malian to report Jonathan's behavior to the police, but Malian hesitated. She didn't want to provoke him further or involve the authorities in what she still hoped was a manageable situation. Jonathan's actions grew more erratic as time went on. He began posting cryptic messages on social media, lamenting about betrayal and lost love. Friends who saw the posts were unsettled but unsure how to intervene. Behind closed doors, Jonathan was unraveling. His obsession with Malian consumed him, driving him to desperate measures. He convinced himself that if he couldn't have her, no one else could. By December 2024, the situation had reached a boiling point. Malian, feeling a mix of fear and resolve, confided in a close friend that she was considering moving again, this time to an undisclosed location. But before she could act on those plans, Jonathan made his own. December 3rd, 2024, began like any other morning in DeKalb County, Georgia. The weather was unremarkable, cloudy with a chill in the air, a typical winter morning. Inside Malian Johnson's modest home, the day had started with the usual rhythm of family life. The smell of breakfast lingered in the air, and laughter echoed as Braylon and Amaya played in the living room under Kaylin's watchful eye. Malian had been on the phone earlier, discussing holiday plans with a friend. Christmas was just weeks away, and despite the tension with Jonathan, she had been determined to make the season joyful for her family. She had even begun looking into decorating ideas with Kaylin the night before. But while the Johnson family went about their mourning, a storm was brewing just outside their door. Jonathan Darden had been parked down the street for hours. His car, a faded blue sedan, was a familiar but unwelcome sight in the neighborhood. In the days leading up to the tragedy, Jonathan's behavior had grown increasingly volatile. The notes he left at Malian's door became more threatening, veiled in language that oscillated between pleas for reconciliation and dark warnings. Friends who had seen him around described him as unshaven, disheveled, and muttering to himself about betrayal. On this particular morning, Jonathan's rage reached its peak. Witnesses would later report seeing him pacing near his car, occasionally glancing toward Malian's house with a look of cold determination. At 9:30 a.m., Jonathan finally stepped out of the car. In his hand was a semi-automatic handgun, purchased legally years earlier, but now used as a tool of vengeance. He approached the house with purpose, his face set in a grim mask. Malian was the first to see him. She had gone to the front window to check on the mail when she noticed Jonathan walking up the driveway. Her heart sank. She knew this confrontation was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to happen like this, unannounced and unprovoked. She opened the door just enough to tell him to leave. Jonathan, however, was not there to talk. He pushed his way inside, his voice raised and trembling with anger. The argument that followed was explosive. Jonathan accused Malian of betraying him, of tearing their family apart. His voice carried through the house, alarming Kaylin, who quickly ushered the children into a back room. Kaylin called 911 as the shouting escalated, her voice shaking as she described the scene unfolding. "My mother-in-law's ex is here," she whispered. "He's angry and he has a gun. Please send help." The exact sequence of events remains unclear, but what is known is that the argument turned physical. Jonathan's rage boiled over, and he pulled out the gun. The first shot rang out, silencing Malian's pleas for him to leave. Kaylin, hearing the gunfire, screamed. She tried to barricade herself and the children in the back room, but Jonathan was relentless. He kicked down the door, his face twisted with fury. Kaylin begged for mercy, shielding Braylon and Amia as best as she could, but Jonathan was beyond reason. He fired multiple shots, ending the lives of Kaylin and her 2 young children in a horrifying act of violence. With the family gone, Jonathan stood amidst the devastation he had caused. Blood stained the walls and floor, and the once cozy home was now a scene of unspeakable horror. Realizing the enormity of his actions, and knowing there was no way back, Jonathan made his final decision. He turned the gun on himself, ending his life with a single shot to the head. When police arrived minutes later, the house was eerily silent. Officers who entered the scene were met with the gruesome reality of what had occurred. One officer, a veteran of over 20 years, described it as one of the most horrifying things he had ever witnessed. Outside, neighbors gathered, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. No one could comprehend how such a tragedy had unfolded in their quiet community. The brutal massacre that took place on December 3rd left an entire community reeling, but it also left a slew of unanswered questions hanging in the air like an oppressive fog. What could have been done to prevent this? In the weeks that followed, as the details of the crime emerged, friends, family, and even law enforcement began to ask themselves that very question. Some wondered if anyone had seen the warning signs. Jonathan had been a fixture in Malian's life for years, and many who knew him said he had always struggled with intense jealousy and a controlling demeanor. But it wasn't until the weeks leading up to the murders that his behavior became overtly erratic. Could Malian have seen the signs earlier? Could she have done something to break free from his grip before he spiraled into violence? Did she give him too many chances, holding on to the hope that he might change? Or was she simply trying to protect her family from an unpredictable and dangerous man? The police revealed that in the months before the murders, Jonathan had made increasingly alarming threats. Neighbors recalled hearing him yell at Malian outside their home late at night. Was there ever a moment where someone should have intervened more forcefully? Could a restraining order or therapy have altered the outcome? Or was the tragedy inevitable, a result of Jonathan's psychological deterioration that could no longer be stopped? In the wake of such violence, it is natural to search for answers, even if they may never fully emerge. Investigators, while piecing together the narrative, are left with the haunting question: how did a man who once professed love for these people, a man who had children with Malian, a man who shared holidays and moments of joy with them, turn into a killer who wiped out an entire family? For the surviving family members, the aftermath was devastating. Malian's family, who had been hopeful about her new life in Georgia, now found themselves grappling with grief that was almost unimaginable. Her mother, who had raised her to believe in the power of second chances, was struck numb by the brutality of her daughter's death. For Molly and sister, it felt as though the life they had built together had been shattered in an instant. In interviews, she described feeling as if a part of herself had been taken away with her sister and niece, unable to comprehend how someone they once trusted could do such a thing. The questions from the surviving family were endless, their grief turning into an overwhelming blur of anger and heartbreak. How could Jonathan, someone they once allowed into their lives, be capable of such destruction? Was there nothing that could have been done to stop him before it was too late? Kaylin's family, too, was left to cope with the devastating loss of a daughter, a wife, and a mother. Her parents, who had once been excited about their daughter's new life in Georgia, now found themselves wrestling with guilt and sorrow, wondering if there were signs they had missed, or if they could have done more to protect her. What makes this case even more painful is the tragic loss of the two young children, Braylon and Amia, who were both full of potential. The youngest of the two, Braylon, had just turned 5 years old, and Amia, who was only 3, had a bright, infectious smile that could light up the room. Their loss, innocent, senseless, left a hole in the hearts of anyone who had known them. Their school friends, who now had to face the reality of growing up without them, often sat in silence, questioning why their classmates were gone. Teachers and counselors who had spent time with Braylon and Amia were stunned. In one interview, a teacher said, "They were the kind of kids you couldn't help but love, the kind of kids who would make you smile even on the hardest days. Losing them feels like losing a piece of the future." The investigation into the deaths of Molly, Kaylin, and the children quickly became a high-profile case, not only because of the brutality of the crime, but also due to the emotional toll it took on the community. DeKalb County, normally quiet and peaceful, was now struggling to come to terms with what had happened in one of its own homes. As detectives worked to piece together the details of the crime, the community followed every twist and turn. The police released information on Jonathan's background, detailing how his behavior had escalated in the months prior to the killings. The discovery of his journal, found in his car, was both chilling and telling. In it, Jonathan had written about his obsessive thoughts regarding Molly's decision to leave him and his inability to move on. The journal entries revealed a deep resentment, his feelings of rejection and anger manifesting into thoughts of revenge against the woman he once loved. Neighbors and friends of Jonathan's family were stunned. Many had seen him as a quiet, troubled man, but no one had anticipated this violent outcome. In one interview, a former co-worker of Jonathan's said, "He was always distant, but nothing about him ever seemed dangerous." It was this perception of Jonathan as someone who didn't outwardly appear to be a threat that left the community unsure about how to spot the early signs of his violent tendencies. As the investigation continued, the question on everyone's minds was, could this tragedy have been avoided if someone had stepped in sooner? Was there enough support for Molly to escape Jonathan's control, or did the fear of him drive her to remain in a toxic relationship longer than she should have? Meanwhile, the broader community was left to wrestle with how they could prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Local leaders organized vigils and support groups for those grieving, but the scars on the hearts of the family, friends, and community members would take years to heal. The effects of this crime would ripple throughout the local area for months, even years to come. The children's school, shaken by the loss of their classmates, implemented new grief counseling programs and created spaces for students to express their sorrow. While these efforts were well-meaning, they could never replace the innocence stolen from those children, or the joy stolen from Molly's and Kaylin's families. Law enforcement, too, faced scrutiny. Although they responded quickly after the 911 call, some questioned whether they could have done more earlier in the process, perhaps by intervening during one of Jonathan's previous altercations with Molly. Advocates for domestic abuse victims emphasized the importance of recognizing early warning signs of abusive behavior and providing better resources for victims who are trying to break free. As the months passed and the pain began to settle into a permanent ache, the ultimate question persisted. How did a man who once professed love, a man who had shared moments of joy and tenderness with the victims, end up capable of such devastation? To fully understand the gravity of what occurred in DeKalb County, Georgia, we must examine the psychological state of Jonathan Darden, the man responsible for this senseless act of violence. Psychological experts and criminologists alike have weighed in on the complexities of Jonathan's mindset and how his emotional instability might have driven him to commit such a horrific crime. Jonathan Darden's behavior, as evidenced by his actions leading up to and during the murder-suicide, paints the picture of a man who struggled with profound psychological issues. His history with Malian was marked by a toxic, emotionally dependent relationship, characterized by a pattern of manipulation, possessiveness, and control. These traits are common in individuals who suffer from attachment disorders or personality disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, BPD, or narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Attachment theory provides us with a framework for understanding how Jonathan's intense fear of abandonment likely fueled his violent outbursts. According to this theory, individuals with insecure attachment styles often struggle to regulate their emotions, particularly in relationships where they feel threatened or rejected. For Jonathan, the breakup with Malian represented not only the end of a romantic relationship but also a catastrophic loss of control, something he desperately clung to. His inability to process this rejection may have triggered a deep emotional crisis, leading to his violent response. Psychologists argue that Jonathan's escalating obsession with Malian, coupled with his fragile sense of self, indicates a profound fear of being abandoned. This fear often manifests as extreme jealousy and possessiveness. He didn't see his relationship with Malian as a partnership, but as an ownership of her. His jealousy wasn't just about not wanting her to be with someone else. It was about feeling as though his identity and control were slipping away. Jonathan's actions were not those of someone who could accept rejection and move on. They were those of someone who was consumed by an obsessive need to maintain control. Obsessive love, often coupled with jealousy, is a toxic dynamic that can have disastrous consequences when one partner believes that their love and emotional security are somehow tied to the other person's presence or behavior. Many experts point out that obsessive love doesn't always manifest as typical romantic behavior. In fact, what often appears to be devotion can, in reality, be an unhealthy attachment. For Jonathan, love wasn't a mutual experience of respect and understanding. It was a demand for total submission and unwavering loyalty. He couldn't cope with the idea that Malian wanted to leave him, and that sense of loss spiraled into a violent desire to punish those who had betrayed him. Jealousy, especially when taken to an extreme, clouds judgment and distorts the way a person views their relationship with others. In Jonathan's case, his jealousy over Malian's decision to end their relationship likely intensified with every passing day. The idea of losing her to another man became more than just an emotional setback. It became an existential threat to Jonathan's sense of self-worth and power. Studies show that jealousy is often linked to a lack of emotional regulation. For some individuals, the inability to manage these overwhelming feelings can escalate to violence. In Jonathan's case, once the jealousy over his partner's desire for independence merged with the obsessive need to possess her, the end result was catastrophic. What began as a complex emotional issue became a lethal concoction of rage, frustration, and desperation. Jonathan's inability to handle the breakup and his overwhelming sense of rejection speaks to a larger, much more common societal issue: unhealthy attachment patterns in relationships. Psychologists have long warned about the dangers of codependent relationships, in which one partner's identity and self-worth are entirely tied to the other. Jonathan's case exemplifies how emotionally unstable individuals, who lack a healthy sense of self and self-worth, can go to extreme lengths to hold on to a relationship that is ultimately unhealthy. There are countless individuals who struggle with relationships where one partner becomes emotionally abusive, not out of malice, but out of deep insecurity and fear of being abandoned. The toxic behavior often includes attempts to control the other partner, creating a sense of dependence and powerlessness. When this controlling behavior is coupled with jealousy and obsession, it forms a dangerous dynamic that can escalate quickly. What's particularly heartbreaking in Jonathan's case is the way his behavior seemingly went unnoticed until it was too late. For friends and family, Jonathan was seen as a man who loved his partner but just couldn't seem to get his life together. His jealousy, while often remarked upon, was shrugged off as an unfortunate trait that he couldn't control. It wasn't until it became violent that anyone truly saw how deep his issues ran. This is a phenomenon all too common in cases of domestic violence. When jealousy and obsessive love are allowed to fester in silence, they can easily explode into violence. The tragic events in DeKalb County serve as a painful reminder of the broader issues surrounding domestic violence, unhealthy relationships, and the failure to intervene before it's too late. As Malian and Kaylin's families try to process the devastation, many have begun to question how society handles instances of domestic violence, particularly in cases where the warning signs are clear but not acted upon. Domestic violence experts point to the alarming rate at which warning signs are overlooked or downplayed. Studies suggest that many victims of domestic violence suffer in silence, often because they fear the social stigma of speaking out or don't recognize the danger they're in until it's too late. Friends, family members, and coworkers are often the first to notice when someone is in an abusive or controlling relationship, but many don't know how to intervene or don't want to get involved. Jonathan's behavior was clearly erratic long before he killed Malian, Kaylin, and the children. His jealousy, his threatening behavior, his controlling tendencies, they were all signs that he was losing his grip on reality. And yet, no one stepped in to help Malian before it escalated into violence. This is a heartbreaking reality for many victims of domestic violence, who often feel isolated and without support. In the wake of this tragedy, the question arises, what responsibility do we have as a society to recognize the signs of unhealthy relationships? Emotional abuse is often harder to detect than physical abuse, but its effects can be just as damaging. Jonathan's obsession with Malian, the jealousy, and the emotional manipulation were forms of emotional abuse that went unnoticed by many until it was too late. His inability to cope with rejection, his obsession with control, and his overwhelming fear of abandonment were the final, destructive pieces in a chain of events that led to the deaths of 4 innocent people. As psychological experts reflect on this case, they urge society to pay closer attention to the warning signs of unhealthy attachment and obsessive behavior in relationships. They stress the importance of understanding that jealousy, possessiveness, and emotional manipulation are not expressions of love. They are signs of emotional instability that can lead to tragic outcomes. While the loss of Malian, Kaylin, and the children is an irreplaceable wound for their families, it also serves as a cautionary tale for us all. It's a stark reminder of the dangers of ignoring the psychological toll that unhealthy relationships can take on individuals and communities. As we come to the close of this tragic story, we're left with haunting questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Was there a turning point where someone could have intervened before Jonathan's obsession and jealousy led to such devastating violence? While it's impossible to say for certain, we can't ignore the signs. The controlling behavior, the escalating jealousy, the unhealthy attachment, that were all visible before the tragedy struck. We want to hear from you, the viewers. What do you think about Jonathan Darden's psychological state? Was his behavior truly a sign of deeper issues, or just a man unable to cope with the rejection? Do you believe there were missed opportunities for intervention? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation and reflect on what could have been done to prevent such a horrific crime. This case is a painful reminder of how devastating the consequences can be when unhealthy relationships spiral into violence. But it's also a call for us to be more aware, to listen when someone is struggling, and to support those who may be trapped in toxic or dangerous situations. If you or someone you know is dealing with similar issues, whether it's relationship abuse, emotional instability, or just a general feeling of being trapped, Remember that there is always help available. Don't wait until it's too late. There are resources, hotlines, and counselors ready to provide support. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, please reach out. You are not alone, and help is available. For anyone in immediate danger, contact your local authorities or reach out to national helplines for domestic violence support. You can also find numerous organizations dedicated to mental health and emotional well-being that can offer assistance and guidance. We hope this story, while heartbreaking, will raise awareness and spark important conversations. Domestic violence and unhealthy attachment are not topics we can ignore, and it's crucial we continue to learn and speak out about the signs, symptoms, and solutions. If you've found this case as impactful as we have, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this one. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. Stay vigilant, stay aware, and together, let's continue to shine a light on the darkness that so often goes unnoticed. Until next time, keep asking the hard questions and never stop seeking the truth behind the stories that matter.